Every civilization that ever touched the Black Sea told the same story. A catastrophic flood, a survivor chosen by forces beyond understanding. The rest of humanity swept away. The Sumerians had Utnapishtim, the Babylonians had Atrahasis, the Greeks had Ogyges and Deucalion, the Hebrews had Noah. The Sumerian version, written on clay tablets around 3200 BCE, predates the book of Genesis by over 1,000 years, and yet the stories are nearly identical. Same flood, same survival, same ending. Civilizations separated by hundreds of kilometers, with no direct communication, telling the same account. That doesn't happen by accident. What's remarkable is that the myths don't contradict each other, they corroborate. Each culture added its own theological framework, its own gods, its own divine reasoning for why the flood was sent. But the core event stayed constant. A flood, sudden, overwhelming, a breach in natural barriers, survival by a single family or chosen individual, the world remade. The Atrahasis epic, the Sumerian story that predates Gilgamesh, describes it this way: the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood. One man is warned, he builds a vessel, he survives. The Gilgamesh version is almost identical. The Greek myth of Deucalion, son of Prometheus, who survived a 9-day flood by building a chest, carries the same bones. Different gods, different names, the same event. Independent cultures don't invent the same catastrophe with the same details. That level of consistency doesn't come from coincidence. It comes from witnessing something so catastrophic that it burns into cultural memory for millennia, and stays there, generation after generation, until someone writes it down. In the 1990s, 2 geologists at Columbia University asked the question nobody had formally posed before. What if they all saw the same thing? What if the flood was real, not divine, not metaphorical, but geological? What if the myths were the only surviving record of an event so violent that every culture surrounding that sea preserved it independently for 7,000 years? Here is what they found. The Black Sea, you can look up on Google Maps right now, was 7,600 years ago a freshwater lake. Not smaller, not different in character. A completely different body of water, isolated from the Mediterranean for thousands of years, sitting roughly 150 meters below where it sits today, and covering about 80,000 square kilometers less surface area than the modern sea. We know this because of sediment cores, cylinders of compressed seabed pulled from the Black Sea floor by oceanographic research vessels. Cores record history in layers. What the Black Sea cores showed, layer by layer, was unambiguous. Freshwater diatoms, freshwater snails, freshwater ostracodes. Every biological signature pointed to a body of water cut off from the salt ocean, living its own isolated life for thousands of years. Then, in the cores, the signal changes. Not gradually. Almost instantly, geologically speaking. Saltwater species, saltwater chemistry. The foraminifera flip from freshwater types to Mediterranean salt-tolerant types. In a transition so sharp, it occupies almost no thickness in the sediment record. Something didn't change the Black Sea slowly. Something changed it in what might have been years or decades at most. In 1997, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, 2 geologists who had spent years pulling these cores and studying the layers, published their conclusion in the journal Science. Around 5,600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea, swollen by post-Ice Age meltwater from retreating glaciers across Europe and Asia, had risen to a level much higher than the Black Sea. The Bosphorus, the narrow strait separating the 2 water bodies, was not the deep channel it is today. It was a dry valley or a shallow stream, a natural barrier holding back the Atlantic-fed Mediterranean from the lower freshwater lake on the other side. The Mediterranean had been pressing against that barrier for years. Then the threshold was crossed. What happened next was the largest flood in recorded human history. When the Bosphorus gave way, water didn't trickle through, it roared. The estimates from Ryan, Pittman, and subsequent modelers, the flow reached approximately 10 cubic miles per day. Niagara Falls carries about 750,000 gallons per second. This flood was 200 times that. 200 Niagara Falls, all roaring into the same basin simultaneously. The sound alone would have been audible for hundreds of kilometers. The Black Sea shoreline, the boundary between water and land where human communities had built their villages, began rising at an estimated 15 centimeters per day. That's a foot every 10 days. A person standing on high ground could watch the waterline advance in real time. In a month, 4.5 meters gone. In a year, 55 meters inland. In a human lifetime, more than 3 kilometers. This was not a flood you could migrate ahead of. The water was always coming. The total land area submerged, approximately 155,000 square kilometers of inhabited coastline, larger than the modern country of Greece, farmland, villages, trade routes, accumulated human settlement going back thousands of years, all of it underwater, in geological terms, almost overnight. The displacement would have been massive, tens of thousands of people, possibly more, suddenly facing the loss of everything, their land, their ancestral sites, the graves of their dead, fleeing in every direction, carrying everything that could be carried, and carrying the story. The people living on those shores didn't vanish. They fled inland, south toward the Nile Delta, east toward Mesopotamia, into the Fertile Crescent, carrying their tools, their knowledge, their agricultural skills, and the memory of what had happened. What the archaeological record shows at exactly this period, around 5,600 BCE, is a sudden, rapid expansion of agricultural settlement into new territories. Farming communities appear in the Nile Delta, in Mesopotamia. The Neolithic period accelerates. The origin points of the world's first advanced civilizations shift. Some researchers examining the timeline and the genetic evidence have proposed that the Black Sea flood refugees were a primary driver of this expansion, that the drowning of one coastline and the displacement of its entire population catalyzed the rise of the world's first cities. The timing is precise, too precise to be coincidental. Genetic analysis of modern populations shows movement consistent with a large-scale displacement from Black Sea coastal regions during exactly this period. Linguistic evidence suggests the rapid spread of Indo-European language families from the Black Sea region around 5,600 BCE. The convergence of geological evidence, archaeological evidence, genetic evidence, and mythological evidence is remarkable, all of them pointing to the same event from different directions. The flood refugees didn't just survive, they seeded civilizations. And in every direction they went, they told what they'd seen. A flood that came from nowhere, a barrier that failed, a world that drowned, a survivor who made it through. Each group told it in the language of their theology, framed it in the cosmology of their gods. But they never changed the core. The flood was real, the displacement was real, the survival was real. That story passed from parent to child across 70 centuries, thousands of generations of oral transmission, before anyone wrote it down on clay tablets, on papyrus, on parchment. By the time it was recorded, the event it described was already thousands of years in the past. But it survived, because what it described was so total, so world-ending for the people who witnessed it, that no generation felt they could leave it out. In 1999 and 2000, Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who found the Titanic, brought his submersibles to the Black Sea. He descended to 150 meters, the depth the models predicted the ancient shoreline would be. His cameras found ancient river valleys, submerged canyon systems, and off the coast of Turkey, what appeared to be the remains of structures, walls, foundations, consistent with Bronze Age settlement patterns sitting on the former seafloor, preserved in the anoxic deep water of the Black Sea where oxygen deprivation prevents decay. The ancient shoreline is still there, right now, 150 meters down, off the Turkish coast, preserved. The Velika River Canyon off Bulgaria, an ancient river valley that once flowed to the lake when it sat much lower, is still there, submerged, confirmed by seismic survey and direct observation. That canyon didn't form recently. It formed when the sea was lower, when the valley was dry land. These aren't interpretations open to multiple readings. They're physical structures on a seafloor that don't belong where they are unless the water level was once dramatically lower. The geological record is clear. The sediment layers record the exact moment salt water arrived. The structures sit on a floor that was once dry land. The canyon was carved by a river that no longer exists. The flood left scars, and the scars are still there. Ryan and Pittman's hypothesis has endured since 1997, but science refines. More recent modeling, including work by Garcia Castellanos and others, suggests the mechanism may have been more gradual than a single catastrophic outburst. Some researchers propose the Bosphorus eroded over longer periods, potentially thousands of years rather than months or decades. The flooding may have been slower, allowing more time to migrate. The displacement may have been more orderly than the most dramatic versions suggest. The debate is genuine. The rates, the timescale, the exact mechanism still live questions in the literature. But the larger facts don't move. The flood happened. The freshwater to saltwater transition is permanent in the sediment record. The displaced populations went somewhere, and the archaeology shows where. Every civilization that surrounded that sea told the same story, and the structures on the seafloor are still there. What Ryan and Pittman did in 1997 wasn't prove the myth, they translated it. They took a story told for 7,000 years in the language of theology and survival, of gods and chosen men and waters that rose, and converted it into sediment layers, seafloor topography, and the chemistry of ancient bones. The story was always accurate, it just needed the science to catch up. When you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature, written on clay tablets more than 5,000 years ago, you're not reading mythology in the sense of invented fiction. You're reading the memory of refugees. You're reading testimony, eyewitness accounts, or the accounts of people who heard them from people who heard them, preserved across 70 centuries of oral tradition before anyone thought to write them down. Each telling added theological interpretation, added the local gods, added the moral framework the culture needed to make sense of what had happened. But the core event never changed, because it was too real, too total, too recent in human memory terms to be distorted beyond recognition. What happened at the Black Sea around 5,600 BCE did exactly what the myths describe. It changed the trajectory of human civilization. It forced the migration of tens of thousands of people from their ancestral lands. It ended a freshwater lake that had existed for thousands of years and replaced it with open saltwater. It seeded, indirectly, the populations that would build the first cities, the first writing systems, the first agricultural empires. It did, in a very real sense, remake the world. Not the whole world, but the world that mattered to the people who experienced it. The world they had always known. The shores they had always lived on. The lake that had always been there. Robert Ballard's cameras have already been to the ancient shoreline. It's at 150 meters depth, off the Turkish coast, sitting exactly where the models predicted it would be. Walls and foundations, preserved in anoxic water, waiting for the next submersible to illuminate them. The myths aren't superstition. They're the oldest surviving evidence we have of something that actually happened. The flood was real,